Hello everyone, Professor Crislek here. So I wanted to make a video thinking about public policy and comparative public policy. So when we think about public policy, building off what we talked about in class, we're really talking about what governments choose to do or choose not to do. As we saw from some of our examples, they are policies that get implemented, actions governments choose to take, as well as some options they choose not to take, issues they choose not to address. So these are issues that governments choose to do, choose not to do, about problems in society. So, public policy, of course, includes laws, regulations, court decisions, and government programs. But it also, as we talked about, includes inaction, choosing not to address certain issues. If a government decides not to regulate something or not to address what is considered a problem, it is still a policy choice. Public policy shapes everyday life in ways that are oftentimes invisible. But as we talked about and discussed in class, public policy is all around us, impacting our lives in ways that maybe we don't know, we don't think about, or we just accept that that is what is going on around us. So we know that public policy affects the schools you attend, how much, and the taxes that you pay, the health care you receive, the jobs that are available, and even, as was brought up in class, the environment that surrounds you. So, in comparative politics, we are not just talking about what public policy is or what public policy looks like within the United States. We are kind of asking something a little bit more interesting, I think. And that is, why do different countries respond differently to seemingly similar problems? If you think about it, most countries face very similar challenges. Most countries, all countries, deal with the concerns of education, about healthcare, inequality, immigration policy, economic development, and again, environmental concerns. However, we know that not all countries try to solve these problems in the same way. So, building off of what our reading from the textbook talked about, we can think about welfare policy. In a country like Sweden, you see a broad, universal welfare state with strong public support for things like healthcare, childcare, parental leave. In the United States, by contrast, welfare policy is more limited and certainly more targeted. And these policies then advocate for greater reliance on private markets. Another example our textbook uses is France, where you see a strong state, pretty strong state role combined with generous family benefits and social insurance. So the question then becomes from our reading is, why do countries with similar problems choose different policy paths? And there are several reasons for this. First, countries have different political institutions. A presidential system like the United States works very differently than a parliamentary system like the United Kingdom. Federal systems distribute power across multiple levels of government, while unitary systems centralize authority, which means that it allows a greater finding of solutions to similar problems. Second, countries have different political cultures and historical traditions. What citizens and leaders believe is appropriate, maybe fair, or legitimate varies significantly across societies. Third, there are differences in party systems and ideology. Some countries have stronger left leaning parties, others have stronger conservative traditions, stronger conservative parties, and that, of course, shapes the kinds of policies that are adopted within the country. Utilizing and thinking about our in class assignment, when we looked at Spain or Poland, we saw different parties really advocating for different policy solutions to issues in the country. So when we think about political parties and then what they stand for, and you wrote about different political parties and what they stand for, we see they, once in power, can have different policy solutions. Our textbook also brings up that countries differ in the strength, in the influence of interest groups, businesses, unions, social and protest movements. These actors play a major role in, again, shaping policy outcomes. So when we study comparative public policy, we are really studying institutions and culture and, of course, power and how they come together to shape government decisions. Okay. So to better understand how policy is made, we oftentimes use something called the policy cycle. The policy cycle is a way of breaking public policy making into stages. These stages typically include agenda setting, formulation, adoption, implementation, and evaluation. Um, it is important here at the outset to recognize that this is in our textbook, which covers a wide variety of issues, does offer a simplified model. We know that real policy making is oftentimes messy, overlapping, and of course political. But the cycle gives us a useful framework for thinking about how policies develop over time. So the first step in the first stage in the policymaking process is about agenda setting. This is about attention. Not every social problem becomes a policy priority. Governments have limited time and limited resources, so actors compete to get issues on the agenda. Media coverage, maybe protest movements, elections, and crises all play a role in shaping what policymakers pay attention to. So next is the policy formulation, where governments begin developing possible solutions to those problems. So at this stage, experts, bureaucrats, political parties, and interest groups all help shape the options that are considered to solve what is now perceived as important enough for governments to engage with. So next comes policy adoption, where decisions are really made. In democratic systems, this oftentimes involves debates, negotiation, and of course, compromise. In authoritarian systems, decisions may be made more quickly, but with less public input. So after that, we move into the implementation stage, which is where policy is actually put into practice. This stage is critical because a policy can often look effective or look like it's going to be worthwhile on paper, but fail when it is carried out. Implementation depends heavily on bureaucratic capacity, again, resources, and administrative skill. And finally, there is the evaluation stage, where governments assess whether a policy worked. Did it solve the problem it was meant to address? Or did it create new problems, new issues? Were there secondary impacts that the policymakers didn't think about, or maybe didn't consider, or unintended consequences? So when we create public policy, we know there are always these secondary and downstream impacts from the policy that maybe were unintended or not fully considered when that public policy making was first set up. So, based on evaluation, policies may oftentimes be revised, maybe even expanded if it's working out, or we know sometimes abandoned if it seems like that public policy just simply is not working. So another key idea that the textbook brings up, and another key idea in public policy, is that governments have different tools in achieving their goals. These are often called policy instruments, and they are typically grouped into three categories: sticks, carrots, and sermons. So sticks are rules backed by penalties. This includes things like taxes, fines, legal restrictions. Governments use sticks when they want to compel behavior. Carrots are incentives. This debate over carrots and sticks. Carrots are incentives. This includes subsidies, tax credits, and benefits designed to encourage people to act in certain ways. Carrots are often used when governments want cooperation rather than punishment. So we see carrots when it comes to EV usage. Under previous administrations that wanted more electric vehicles to be purchased, there were carrots and subsidies that subsidized the purchase of EVs, because the government wanted a policy that encouraged, through market mechanisms, more purchasing of electric vehicles, and so they used a carrot and subsidies, encouraging people to buy more EVs. So sermons are persuasive tools. These include public awareness campaigns and messaging aimed at shaping attitudes and behavior. Sermons are usually less costly, but they rely on voluntary compliance. Different governments rely on different combinations of these tools, and they affect how citizens experience policy in their daily lives. Now, one of the most common assumptions is that policy making is always straightforward, that governments carefully define goals, evaluate options, and choose the best solution. This is called, and something that we've encountered earlier semesters, of the rational model. We know, though, in reality, policy making is oftentimes far messy and far less orderly. So the incremental model suggests that governments usually make small adjustments to existing policies rather than pursuing large-scale, sudden changes. This is because compromise is politically easier and oftentimes less risky. The textbook also talks about the garbage can model, which goes even further, suggesting that policy making can be disorganized, can be unpredictable. Problems, solutions, and decision makers do not always line up neatly. Sometimes policies emerge from timing, emerge from chance, or political opportunity rather than through careful planning. These alternative models remind us that policymaking is not just a technical process that is clean and neat and tidy, but it is also deeply political. Another important concept from the reading is policy style. Policy style refers to the typical way a country makes and implements policy. Sorry, my dog's still over here playing. She's making a ruckus. So it reflects a combination of values, traditions, and institutional arrangements. So some systems are more consensus oriented, emphasizing negotiation, emphasizing compromise. Others are more adversarial with visible conflict between competing actors. So the examples from the reading is Sweden, which is often seen as a consensus-based system, where policymakers work closely with organized interests to reach agreements. The United States, by contrast, tends to be more conflict-driven, with greater partisan competition and institutional fragmentation. So policy style helps explain why countries respond differently, again, to similar problems. So we should consider for a minute how policies spread across countries. This is where the concept of policy diffusion and policy convergence comes in. Policy diffusion refers to the process by which ideas and policies spread from one country to another. Governments often learn from what others are doing or adopt policies that appear to be successful. Policy convergence refers to the idea that policies may become more similar over time, especially as countries face similar challenges and operate within a globalized system. However, even with these pressures, national differences do persist. Domestic politics absolutely plays a role, a central role in shaping policy outcomes. And finally, because it's been at the center and a hallmark of our class, it is important to distinguish between democratic and authoritarian policy making. In democratic systems, policy making tends to involve more actors. We can imagine more power across society, public opinion, elections, and political parties. Even interest groups all play a role. This often makes policymaking slower, but also it allows more participation and holds government officials more accountable. In authoritarian systems, decision making is more centralized. Leaders face fewer institutional constraints and can oftentimes implement policies more quickly. However, these systems tend to have weaker feedback mechanisms. Again, elections are a feedback mechanism, and less public input. So, for example, China has been able to rapidly mobilize resources for industrial production and industrial policy. But it does so without the same level of public accountability found within democratic systems. So let's just spend a minute thinking about the main takeaways from the reading. Comparative public policy is about understanding how power, institutions, and political context shape real world outcomes. Countries may face similar problems, but they do not make the same public policy choices. Those differences reflect deeper structural, institutional, political, cultural, and differences between interest group power and state capacity. These issues all play a role. So ultimately, studying this comparative public policy does help answer this important question about who has the power to decide what governments do and how governments react to the same issues. Thank you.